Hello my friends, welcome back to the implementation of our machine learning pipeline, and now here we go with a new code section where this time we'll define a function that extracts the features and target from the training set and the test set. In other words, we'll be creating separately the matrix of features and the vector of dependent variable. Alright, so we are still in between these two steps of the pipeline, we already made that function that reads the data in S3, but then in order to prepare for the training, well, we need to do some extra data preprocessing, like exactly getting the training set and the test set and getting separately the matrix of features and the vector of dependent variable. Alright, so let's do this, and as you can see then we'll be ready for the training. Okay? So, once again we start with def because we're defining a new function, which this time we're going to call extract underscore features underscore and underscore target. Just to make things super clear, that's rather for educational purposes, but of course if you want you can give a shorter name to that function. But there we go, that function is going to take as input first the headers and then the data. Alright, then colon, and then here we go, let's define what this function has to do. Alright, so well, it's very simple, it's just going to take 3 lines, one line to get the matrix of features, another line to get the vector of dependent variable, and one final line to return both. Okay, so let's start with the matrix of features, which as usual we're going to call X, and which will contain of course all the rows of our data set, but excluding the last column. Okay, because we only want to take the features and we have the target in the last column of our data. And so how can we do that? Well, I suggest we do another one-line for loop, which therefore we're going to include in a pair of square brackets. And so well, let's start with the simplest. We're going to do the for loop first. So we're going to loop over all the rows in the data. And then remember, when it's a one-line for loop, what happens for each of the row has to be implemented before. So before, that's where we're going to select, for each row, all the columns except the last one. Okay. And so how do we do that? Well, first we take our row, of course, then we add a pair of square brackets, and then you know how to do this. We take the range of all the columns, excluding the index of the last column, which if we want to generalize this to any data set of any number of columns, well, we can get with -1. -1 is the index of the last column. And so how do we get that range? Well, we take the whole range first with a colon. So that's the whole range, basically, including the lower bound and the upper bound. But then in order to exclude the last column, we just have to enter the index of that last column, -1, because indeed in Python, the upper bound of a range is excluded. And so this is exactly the range of all the columns excluding the last one. Okay, and that's exactly what we want because indeed it will include only the features. Okay, but then we have to do something else here. Can you guess what it is? It's just a matter of format, to give the future tools that we'll use to train our random forest regressor model the right format. And part of that right format is to make sure that everything is a float. Okay, all the cells in the matrix of features must be floats. Okay, and so how are we going to do that? Well, we would be tempted to apply directly the float function to our columns here, but unfortunately in Python that doesn't work. This will lead to an error. So what we have to use is the map function, which is a built-in Python function that applies a given function, which will be the float function, to all the items in an input list, which here will be all the feature values of the row. Okay, and so that's exactly how we're going to apply that float function to make sure that all the feature values in the row are float. Okay, so let me show you how we do this. First, we're going to remove that parenthesis here, separate by a space. And then at the left of the float, we're going to call the map function, which will take as inputs first the float function, which we want to apply to all the elements of the row. And then, as you might guess, the second input will be the whole row itself, meaning the list of all the elements of the row except of course the last column, meaning the list of all the feature values of that specific row. And so there you go. Then we already have our closing parenthesis, so that's perfect. And now finally, remember that we want to make a matrix of features, therefore of 2 dimensions. And in Python, a matrix in 2D is basically an array within a double pair of square brackets. And now if you notice, we only have one pair of square brackets, which is this one, right? That closing pair bracket with the opening square bracket. And so we have to make it a 2D array. And one simple trick to do that is to call the list function on this whole row, and of course for each of the row. So that list function is called for each of the row in the data. Okay. And now there we go. We have our matrix of features in the correct format. So that's perfect. And now, next step, let's take care of the vector of the dependent variable, which as usual we're going to call y, little y, And this time, how are we going to get that? Well, it's even much simpler here. Because first, this time it's going to be a 1D array, so we don't have to call the list function to make it a 2D array. That's the first thing. And then, because in each row there are going to be only one element, which is the target value, well, actually we can directly call the float function on that one feature value for each row without calling the map function, okay? So it's going to be super simple. How can we do that efficiently? Well, let me actually, copy this whole line. I'm going to paste it below and we're just going to remove things. So as we said, we don't need either the map function nor the list function. So I'm removing this. Then we said that we can directly apply the float function on that single element in the row, which is the target value. And besides, because it's only the target value here, we don't need the range given by the colon here. So I'm removing it. And here we can remove a parenthesis. And there you go. I think we're done here. As you can see, it was pretty easy. Alright, and finally, last and easiest step, we finally return the matrix of features x first and then the vector of dependent variable y. And that's it. Now finally, we're completely done doing the necessary work in between these two steps of the pipeline, and we can eventually implement that exciting step where Lambda will train and retrain the machine learning model automatically as the data comes in.
Now make sure to check out these videos on the right or the full course in the description to continue your learning, and I look forward to seeing you there.